Today morning, Minnesota National Guard traps 2,000 federal agents. Minneapolis under siege.
The clock reads 3:47 a.m. on a frozen Minneapolis morning, and what unfolds over the next 6 hours will expose a criminal network so deeply embedded in state government that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about power in America. This is the story of Operation Midnight Collapse, the largest cartel infiltration of a U.S. state government ever discovered, the arrest of 43 officials, and the seizure of over 2 tons of fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin moving through Minnesota's highways every single week. The Minnesota winter doesn't just bite. It stings. The temperature has dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and a brutal Arctic front has locked the Twin Cities in a frozen cage. Visibility is near zero. The streets near the Whipple Federal Building are empty except for the whisper of wind cutting through downtown Minneapolis. Under the pale flicker of streetlights, the air is thick with more than just freezing fog. It is heavy with the weight of an impending catastrophic revelation. For the past 72 hours, something unprecedented has been happening in the shadows of this city. While the world watched a separate immigration enforcement operation unfold on the news, federal agents from the FBI, DEA, and DHS have been conducting a completely different operation. One that has nothing to do with the rhetoric on cable news. This operation targets something far more dangerous. A criminal conspiracy so vast that it reaches into the governor's mansion, into the state police, into the courts, and into the highest levels of local law enforcement across the entire state of Minnesota. At 3:47 a.m., the first tactical teams move into position. They are not marching down Main Street. They are moving in surgical silence through the frozen industrial corridors of South Minneapolis. 4 separate strike teams converge on 4 separate targets simultaneously. This is coordinated federal enforcement at its most lethal and precise. Dozens of FBI and DEA agents in black tactical gear breach the doors of a warehouse in the St. Paul industrial zone. Flashbangs explode in the darkness. The sound is like thunder in a concrete tomb. Inside, they find exactly what the intelligence suggested they would find: a fentanyl superlab operating with the sophistication of a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. Industrial pill presses. Vacuum sealers. Thousands of gallons of precursor chemicals in steel drums marked with false shipping labels claiming they contain agricultural fertilizer. But the fentanyl is just the beginning. In the back corner of that warehouse, sealed inside a reinforced steel container, agents discover something that changes the entire trajectory of the investigation. Encrypted hard drives. Thousands of them. Server farms. And in a separate locked case, printed ledgers written in a careful bureaucratic hand. These are not the notes of street-level dealers. These are command-level logistics documents. Route schedules. Border crossing times. The names of state police supervisors who coordinate traffic control when convoys pass through certain highways. The signatures of judges who dismiss drug-related charges before they reach trial. At the same moment, across the city in the Pearl District, another breach team hits a different target. This one is not a warehouse. It is the private penthouse of Marcus Holloway, the state's former director of commerce. The agents find him asleep in his bed. They find something far more valuable in his study: a personal computer still logged into an encrypted communication network. When they seize it and bring it to the Federal Forensics Laboratory, analysts will later discover that Holloway has been in direct communication with cartel logistics coordinators using coded messages hidden inside photographs of Minnesota lakes and shipping manifest PDFs. The third team moves on a different kind of target. They descend on the headquarters of Northlands Logistics, a trucking company that operates throughout the upper Midwest. The company shows legitimate revenue on the books. But the agents know the truth. Every third truck that leaves the Northlands facility is loaded with something other than the manifest's claim. One truck carries fresh vegetables from a fictional farm in Wisconsin. The vegetables are real. But underneath the produce, packed in industrial-grade vacuum-sealed containers, are 200 kilograms of cocaine destined for distribution hubs in Chicago and Milwaukee. Another truck claims to carry textile goods. The textiles are real. But hidden within the cargo are over 400,000 fentanyl pills pressed with a street name stamp of Blue Death. When federal agents crack open the company's financial systems, they discover that Northlands Logistics receives wire transfers from shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada. The shell corporations are owned by other shell corporations. The money flows across borders through cryptocurrency exchanges in Hong Kong. Then it surfaces in Minnesota as legitimate business income funneled through car dealerships, restaurant chains, and real estate development companies. The fourth team hits something even more sensitive. They move on the personal residence of Superior Court Judge Patricia Donnelly. Judge Donnelly, who has been on the bench for 18 years. Judge Donnelly, who has presided over hundreds of drug cases. Judge Donnelly, whose consistent pattern of dismissing DEA cases has been noticed by federal investigators for the past 2 years. When they search her home, They find a safety deposit box key taped inside a hollowed-out law book. The safety deposit box, when opened by federal court order, contains over $700,000 in cash and a leather journal filled with dates, names, and case numbers with notations like favorable ruling executed as instructed and CJN payment received, account verified. By 6:15 a.m., these 4 raids have only been the opening move. The Federal Command Center located inside the federal courthouse downtown has transformed into a war room. Massive digital displays show a real-time map of Minnesota with dozens of red markers pulsing across multiple cities and counties. Each marker represents a location identified for federal action. Each location is connected by flowing lines of data showing the movement of drugs, money, and information through the state's network. The briefing room is filled with over 300 federal agents, state police officials who have not been compromised, and a team of forensic accountants who have spent the last 6 months tracing financial flows. The operation, which has been code-named Project Midnight Collapse, is now in its active execution phase. The operation commander, FBI Special Agent Thomas Corrigan, stands before the assembled officers. At this moment, he says, we have 1,200 federal agents in motion across Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. We have identified over $35 million in cartel proceeds moving through state financial systems per month. We have identified 12 law enforcement officers on cartel payroll. We have identified 3 sitting legislators who have accepted bribes to protect smuggling corridors. And we have identified 1 person at the very top of the conspiracy. He pauses. The room is silent. The conspiracy, Agent Corrigan continues, is being directed by Governor Richard Hayes, governor of the state of Minnesota. He has been the unknowing public face of one of the largest organized crime operations ever to infiltrate U.S. state government. The revelation hits the room like a shockwave. Governor Richard Hayes has been in office for 4 years. He ran on a platform of economic development and border security. He has been featured on national news programs discussing his tough stance on immigration and drugs. But the encrypted communications found on the seized servers tell a different story. Hayes has been actively directing DEA agents away from certain locations. Hayes has been providing weekly briefings to cartel liaisons about federal enforcement operations planned for Minnesota. Hayes, through his chief of staff and legal advisor, has been ensuring that cartel money laundering operations are protected from state audits. The evidence is overwhelming. Email chains, recorded phone calls, financial transactions traced to offshore accounts registered in Hayes' wife's maiden name, text messages discussing specific shipments of fentanyl moving through the state, with Hayes asking for confirmation that the route is clear and the Guardians are in position, a reference to the compromised state police supervisors who ensure the convoys pass through highway checkpoints without inspection. By 8:30 a.m., federal agents are moving on every identified location simultaneously. A DEA team hits a drug fortress hidden in the hills outside of Duluth. The residence appears to be a private mansion belonging to a wealthy businessman. When agents breach the front entrance, they find not a residence but a military-style command center. An entire floor of the building is devoted to surveillance equipment monitoring traffic cameras throughout the state. Another floor contains a money-counting operation where stacks of currency are processed through commercial banking machines and then divided into amounts small enough to avoid federal reporting requirements. A third floor contains barracks for cartel security personnel, armed men of military bearing who have been living on site and providing protection for the operation. In the basement, agents discovered drug storage vaults containing over 3 tons of fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin. The fentanyl alone, when analyzed, represents roughly 6 months of the organization's intended distribution to the streets of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and Rochester. Another federal team hits the private offices of Northlands Logistics. They seize over 200 trucks in the company parking lot. They discover hidden compartments in over 170 of those vehicles. They find detailed records showing that trucks have been moving an average of 500 kilograms of cocaine and 600,000 fentanyl pills per week across Minnesota's highways. The records show payment schedules to state police officers. One officer, Captain James Mercer of the Minnesota State Police, has been receiving $75,000 per month to ensure that his Highway Patrol Division maintains strategic gaps in coverage that allow cartel convoys to move without inspection. By 10:15 a.m., federal agents are moving on the most sensitive target of all, the governor's mansion. Armed federal marshals, accompanied by FBI leadership, arrive at the residence. Governor Richard Hayes is arrested on charges of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, money laundering, racketeering, and receipt of bribes. His chief of staff, Deputy Governor Sarah Mitchell, is arrested simultaneously at her home in the suburban community of Edina. His legal advisor, Michael Torres, is arrested at his law office downtown. Over the next 12 hours, additional arrests ripple through state government like shocks from an earthquake. A state senator arrested at his campaign office. A member of the Public Utilities Commission arrested at her home. 3 district court judges arrested at various locations. A superintendent of the Minnesota State Police arrested at the state police headquarters itself, the moment his access credentials are revoked and federal agents escort him from the building. The forensic analysis of the seized hard drives reveals the true scope of the conspiracy. This was not a case of individual officials being corrupted. This was a systematic redesign of state government infrastructure to serve cartel operations. The cartel had not infiltrated Minnesota. Minnesota had been transformed into a cartel-controlled state. Beginning 6 years earlier, when the CJNG cartel identified Minnesota as a strategic hub for drug distribution in the upper Midwest, they had begun a methodical recruitment operation. They targeted state officials with financial vulnerabilities. They identified law enforcement officers with family members who had been arrested on drug charges, officers whose criminal records or troubled children made them susceptible to blackmail and recruitment. They cultivated relationships with local politicians through campaign donations funneled through multiple shell corporations and nonprofit foundations. Within 4 years, they had successfully placed operatives throughout state government. The cartel had not used violence as their primary tool. They had used money. And once officials were compromised, they had used leverage. Governor Hayes, it would later be revealed, had a serious gambling problem. Over 10 years, he had accumulated over $4 million in debt to organized crime gambling operations. The CJNG cartel had systematically paid off his debts in exchange for his cooperation. By the time Hayes ran for governor, he was already owned. The cartel's operation was designed around a principle: move the maximum amount of drugs and money through the state while leaving the minimum amount of evidence. They understood federal law enforcement better than law enforcement understood them. They knew that federal investigations move slowly. They knew that federal prosecutions require overwhelming evidence. So they built redundancy into every system. If one smuggling route was compromised, 7 others were already operational. If one official was arrested, 3 others were ready to assume his responsibilities. The money laundering operation was particularly sophisticated. Rather than funneling cartel proceeds directly into bank accounts, the CJNG had established a network of legitimate-appearing businesses throughout the state. These businesses created real economic activity, real jobs, and real tax revenue. A chain of car dealerships across the Twin Cities would import vehicles from Mexico and resell them domestically, mixing legitimate vehicle sales with the movement of cash-stuffed vehicles destined for Mexico. A series of restaurant chains throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul would move millions of dollars per month in cash sales, with a portion actually being cartel proceeds. A fake agricultural supply company in southern Minnesota would receive shipments from Mexico marked as farm equipment but actually containing cocaine and heroin. What makes this conspiracy so shocking is that the cartel had not just infiltrated state government. They had redesigned state government. The highway patrol was structured to ensure protection for convoys. The court system was structured to ensure that cartel-related cases were either dismissed or resulted in sentences so light that they did not deter cartel operations. The governor's office was structured to ensure that federal agents operating in Minnesota faced bureaucratic obstruction and political interference. By 2 p.m. on that frozen February morning, federal agents have arrested 43 individuals across the state. 23 of those arrests are state, county, or local officials. 14 are direct cartel operatives. 6 are money laundering specialists who worked for shell corporations or legitimate businesses. By evening, the evidence will be so overwhelming and so public that escape from justice becomes impossible. Governor Richard Hayes sits in a federal detention cell. His face is pale. His hands tremble. For the first time in 6 years, he is separated from the layers of protection that cartel membership has provided. He knows that he will face decades in federal prison. He knows that his political career is finished. He knows that his name will be remembered not as a governor who attempted to serve his state, but as the chief architect of the largest criminal conspiracy ever discovered within state government. The question that haunts every federal investigator working on this case is simple but devastating: how deep did this go? And the answer is terrifying. The forensic analysis reveals that the cartel had been operating under the assumption that they had successfully transformed Minnesota into a permanent cartel headquarters. The seized documents contain references to the Minnesota model, a comprehensive blueprint for state-level infiltration and control that the CJNG cartel was planning to replicate in other states. Arizona, Texas, California, Illinois. These were the next targets. The same methods that successfully transformed Minnesota would be deployed systematically across the country. The cartel had created a shadow government. This was not simply corruption. This was command-level infiltration of the state's power structure. The governor served as the public-facing authority figure who could use his legitimate power to shield cartel operations. The police hierarchy served as the enforcement apparatus that would eliminate competition and protect cartel interests. The court system served as the judicial shield that would ensure prosecutions failed and convictions were overturned. What makes this revelation so psychologically devastating is that it forces a confrontation with a fundamental truth. Sometimes the system itself becomes the tool of the criminals. The machinery of government, which is supposed to protect citizens, had been turned into a mechanism for distributing poison, laundering money, and consolidating criminal power. By the end of the day, federal agents have seized over 3 tons of fentanyl alone. The street value of that seizure exceeds $150 million. But the real value of the operation is not measured in dollars. It is measured in the hundreds of thousands of lives that will not be destroyed by the fentanyl that never reaches the streets. It is measured in the dozens of communities throughout Minnesota that will be protected from the violence and decay that cartel presence creates. The fentanyl seizure represents roughly 6 months of the cartel's intended Minnesota distribution. Every pill represents a human being who will not overdose. Every ounce of cocaine represents a community that will not be destabilized by the violence that cocaine distribution creates. Every kilogram of heroin represents families that will not be destroyed by addiction. The arrested state officials face federal sentencing guidelines that will likely result in sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years in federal prison. The cartel operatives face similar sentences. But more importantly, the revealed conspiracy exposes something that American citizens must confront. The systems that govern our states can be corrupted, not by external force, but by systematic infiltration and methodical recruitment of people in positions of power. Governor Hayes, in his mugshot, stares directly at the camera with the vacant expression of someone who has lost everything. His gambling debts were forgiven. His political ambitions were realized. For 6 years, he lived a life of power and influence. But it was a life purchased with the suffering of tens of thousands of people addicted to fentanyl. It was a life purchased with the blood of communities destroyed by cartel violence. It was a life purchased with complicity in human trafficking and organized crime. The Minnesota National Guard, which initially became the subject of national news coverage for their role in managing public unrest, had actually been operating in tandem with federal agents throughout the operation. Their deployment to certain neighborhoods was coordinated with federal raids to ensure that cartel enforcers could not mobilize to defend the conspirators. Their presence reassured communities that state power was being deployed to protect them, not to betray them. The investigation that led to Operation Midnight Collapse began 18 months earlier, when a DEA analyst noticed an anomaly in drug seizure patterns across Minnesota. Drug busts were happening in certain areas with inexplicable regularity, while other areas showed no enforcement activity whatsoever. The pattern suggested that someone was directing enforcement activity away from certain locations. From there, a methodical investigation slowly unraveled the entire conspiracy. What emerges from the forensic analysis is a timeline of calculated deception spanning 6 years. In year 1, the CJNG cartel identified Governor Richard Hayes as a recruitment target. In year 2, they orchestrated the elimination of his gambling debts through an intermediary corporation, creating financial leverage. In year 3, they began recruiting state police officers and lower-level judges. In year 4, they expanded recruitment to include state legislators and cabinet-level officials. In year 5, they established the infrastructure of the Minnesota model, the systematic redesign of state institutions to serve cartel interests. In year 6, they began executing the plan to expand the model to other states. Operation Midnight Collapse interrupted this timeline at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The conspiracy was about to expand beyond Minnesota. The cartel was about to attempt to replicate the Minnesota model in 3 additional states. Had the operation been delayed by even a few months, the conspiracy might have metastasized into a continental criminal network that would have taken decades to unravel. But there is a larger truth that emerges from this investigation, and it is a truth that shapes how we must think about power and corruption in America going forward. The cartel did not succeed through violence or intimidation alone. They succeeded through a simple but devastating principle. They understood that power does not always need to be seized through force. Sometimes power only needs to be purchased. Sometimes corruption only needs to be methodical and patient. The arrested officials did not wake up one morning and decide to become criminals. They became criminals through a series of incremental decisions. The decision to accept the first payment seemed small. The decision to provide the first tip about an enforcement action seemed minor. But each decision created leverage. Each decision created complicity. Each decision made the next decision slightly easier. By the time Governor Hayes had committed to the full conspiracy, he was so deeply embedded that escape had become impossible. He was trapped not by force, but by his own choices and the choices of men who knew how to exploit human weakness. The real cost of this conspiracy is measured not in the 75 arrests or the 3 tons of seized drugs. The real cost is measured in the thousands of people who died of overdoses during those 6 years. The real cost is measured in the children who grew up in neighborhoods destabilized by cartel violence. The real cost is measured in the erosion of trust in government institutions that were supposed to protect citizens. Minnesota will recover from this betrayal. The state will rebuild its institutions. New officials will be elected. New police leadership will be installed. But the scar will remain. The memory of the time when the governor's mansion itself became a drug cartel command center will linger in the collective consciousness of the state. If you're still watching this, understand what you've witnessed. This is not a story about individual corruption. This is a story about how criminal organizations think systematically about state power. This is a warning. This is what happens when nobody is watching. This is what happens when power is allowed to consolidate without accountability. Governor Richard Hayes thought he was powerful. He thought his position made him untouchable. He thought that behind the seal of the governor's office, he could conduct his business with impunity. He was catastrophically wrong. This entire story is fictional and presented for dramatic storytelling purposes. All names, characters, government officials, and details are completely fictional and do not represent real events or real people.